The morning Merritt Holbrook fell through the door of Calloway's Folly, he could not feel his hands. He had been crawling for 20 minutes along the base of the limestone cliff, following a rope he could not see in the white nothing of the storm. His son Eli was behind him, 17 years old and silent, in the way that meant he was past fear and into something deeper. When the rope ended at a wooden door, Merritt did not knock. He simply fell against it. The door opened inward. The candle on the table did not move. That was the first thing Merritt noticed. Not the warmth, though the warmth hit him like a physical force after 8 days of cold that had no bottom. Not James Calloway standing there with an expression that held no triumph in it. The candle, burning straight and still as though the world outside was something that happened to other people. The thermometer on the wall read 17 degrees Celsius. Outside, the storm was eating Dakota alive. Merritt tried to speak. What came out was 3 words broken apart by the shaking of his jaw. You were right. He had been the one who laughed loudest. He needed James Calloway to know that he knew. 7 months before that night, on a morning in July of 1883, when the Dakota sky was the hard, bright blue of a man who has never been wrong, Merritt Holbrook had stood in front of a half-finished cave and told the man building it that he was making the most sophisticated mistake he had ever witnessed. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We need to go back to the beginning, to a room that smelled of old paper and the particular dignity of small authority, to the moment when James Calloway put his finger on a map and changed everything. The office of Mayor Prescott Dunmore occupied the corner of Endurance's only 2-story building, which the mayor considered a monument to the town's ambitions and which everyone else considered a fire hazard. It was July 1883. The heat outside was the kind that made the prairie shimmer like a hallucination. Inside, a single window provided light but not relief. James Calloway stood on one side of the desk. He was 38 years old, built like a man who had spent a decade doing work that required both precision and endurance. His hands were the hands of a surveyor, darkened by sun and ink, the knuckles of a man who had driven stakes into frozen ground at 5 in the morning and read theodolite measurements in driving rain. 8 years with the Northern Pacific Railroad had given him a way of looking at landscape that most men never developed. He did not see land the way a farmer saw it, as something to be worked. He did not see it the way a rancher saw it, as something to be claimed. He saw it as a system, a set of forces operating according to principles that did not care about human opinion. Ottilie Calloway stood beside him. She was 34 with the particular stillness of a woman who had decided long ago that stillness was more useful than noise. Her father had been a master carpenter in Ohio, and she had grown up learning that the difference between a good structure and one that failed in the first hard winter was almost always invisible. It lived in the joints, in the way moisture moved through wood, in the gap between what looked solid and what actually was. Between them and Mayor Dunmore lay a land map of the Endurance territory showing the available parcels under the Homestead Act. Most of them were what anyone would have called good land, river adjacent, flat, arable. James Calloway's finger rested on none of those. It rested on a parcel marked with a diagonal line indicating poor quality. 3 kilometers north of town, where a limestone outcropping rose from the prairie like a thought that the land had been having for 10,000 years. The survey notes beside it said rocky, unworkable, no agricultural value. And then, almost as an afterthought, large cave opening, south-facing, approximately 12 meters wide. Mayor Dunmore looked at the finger, then at James, then back at the finger as though hoping it might move on its own. That's Rock and Brush Calloway, he said. His voice carried the particular confidence of a man who has never been uncertain about anything important. No plow can touch it, barely pastures a goat, and there's a hole in the side of it. The hole, James said, is exactly why I want it. Dunmore looked past James to Ottilie, his expression asking the question he was too polite to say directly. He had known Ottilie's family by reputation. Surely she would be the reasonable one. Ottilie met his eyes and gave one small, deliberate nod. Dunmore leaned back in his chair. He was the kind of man who processed discomfort by making it formal. And so he straightened a stack of papers that did not need straightening and cleared his throat in the manner of a judge about to deliver a verdict he finds distasteful. You intend to live in a cave, Calloway. It is 1883. We are building a civilized town here. We have frame houses and glass windows. A pause. We are not savages. I intend to build a frame house with glass windows, James said, inside the cave. The silence that followed had texture. Dunmore's mouth opened slightly. He looked again at Audley. Audley's expression did not change. She had heard this proposal many times over the past several months, had argued with it, had pressed on it from every angle she could find, and had eventually concluded that the man she had married was not wrong. She had not come to that conclusion easily, but she had come to it. This, Dunmore said slowly, is the most foolish thing I have heard in 20 years of public service. He stamped the papers anyway. The sound of the stamp coming down was like a period at the end of a sentence that everyone in the room understood differently. Outside in the hallway, James heard a man say to another man, 62 days to first frost. Calloway better hurry with his rock house. There was laughter. James noted the number, 62 days. He had worked with tighter margins than that. What Ezra Coltrane heard through the wall of Prescott Dunmore's office was enough. Coltrane was 44 years old and had built the only general store in Endurance through a combination of strategic credit extension and the simple geographic fact that the next supplier was 40 kilometers away. He was not a cruel man, he was a practical one, which in certain circumstances amounts to the same thing. He understood with the clarity of someone who has spent 2 decades in commerce that his business ran on 2 things: people needing supplies and people needing to build things. A man who was building a house bought lumber nails, glass hardware rope, and a dozen other things from Ezra Coltrane. A man who was living in a cave bought almost nothing. He caught James in the street outside. I heard what you're planning, Coltrane said. He did not bother with a preamble. I'm not extending credit for something like that, Calloway. You want supplies for a cave project, you pay double. Or you order from Bismarck and wait 3 weeks for delivery. James looked at him for a moment, not with anger, with the evaluating expression of a man who is recalculating a route. Then I'll order from Bismarck, James said. On what money your survey savings won't last the winter? James did not answer. He turned and walked back to Audley, who had heard the exchange from 3 steps away. She was already composing the letter in her head. They had saved carefully during 8 years of railroad work. Not extravagantly, but enough. She would write to the supplier in Bismarck that evening, pay cash, and arrange delivery by wagon. Coltrane watched them walk away. He said loudly enough for the 6 people within earshot to hear, give them 60 days. He meant before they gave up. What he did not understand and would not understand for 7 months was that the kind of man who chooses a cave over a prairie lot is not the kind of man who gives up when a supply chain becomes complicated. Within a week, Coltrane had organized the first of what would become a Sunday ritual. He would bring a small group of townspeople out to the limestone outcropping to watch the Calloways work, framing it as neighborly curiosity while providing a running commentary that functioned as entertainment. He called the place the Badger Operation. The name spread faster than any news that year. Calloway's Folly came later, courtesy of Orson Pemberton, but that is a different story. The night they made camp at the cave for the first time, James built a small fire near the entrance and drew in the dirt with a stick. Audley sat across from him watching. She was not a woman who needed things explained to her. She was a woman who needed to understand the reasoning, which was different. James began with a memory rather than a theory. His 3rd year surveying for the Northern Pacific, he had been caught by an early October blizzard in Wyoming and had taken shelter in a limestone cave similar to this one. Outside, the temperature dropped to minus 29 Celsius. Inside the cave with no fire, it stayed at 11 degrees. He had noted this in his field journal with the careful attention of a man whose job required him to notice things others missed. He had also noted it the next summer when the cave stayed cool at 12 degrees while the outside air reached 35. The rock was doing something. He had spent 5 years working out what? Limestone of sufficient mass absorbed heat from the earth below. It's slowly the way a heavy iron skillet absorbs heat from a stove. It released that heat with equal slowness. The result was a temperature that barely varied between seasons, hovering around 12 degrees regardless of what the sky was doing. No wooden structure built by human hands could replicate that stability. No amount of insulation could match the thermal mass of 40 vertical feet of solid rock. He also told Audley about Running Elk, a Crow Scout who had guided a survey team through the Powder River Basin in 1878, and who had over 3 weeks of shared campsites taught James something about the way wind moved around hills. Wind was not random. It followed paths the way water followed channels. A hill did not stop wind. It redirected it. The right position in relation to a hill meant living in the quiet water behind a boulder in a stream where the current swept past without touching you. This cave faced south. The hill to the north and east would redirect the prevailing winter winds up and over. The entrance would create a buffer zone of still air that the wind could never reach. Ottilie listened to all of this. Then she contributed what she knew. Her father, working in Ohio, had built barns and houses for 40 years. He had learned that wood rot and structural failure almost always started from moisture moving up from the ground. He had learned to raise floors. He had learned that a dry structure lasted and a damp one failed, no matter how good the joinery. The limestone is dry, she said. We raise the cabin floor 60 centimeters on stone pillars. No moisture can climb that. The wood will be preserved for 100 years. She sketched in the dirt beside his drawing. Double wall construction for the cabin itself, the gap between the inner and outer boards packed with raw wool purchased cheaply from a sheep farmer on the eastern edge of the territory. A small cast iron stove, because the thermal mass of the cave would already do most of the work of keeping the temperature stable. A chimney pipe run up through a natural fissure in the cave ceiling, 40 feet of rock, creating a draft that would exceed any brick chimney ever built. A root cellar dug into softer stone at the back of the cave where the temperature would stay at 7 degrees all year, preserving vegetables without any refrigeration at all. Animal stalls inside the cave. A horse, a milk cow, 2 goats, their body heat contributing to the system. The cave mouth was 12 meters wide and 7.5 meters high. The cabin itself would be built 6 meters back from the entrance, leaving a 6-meter deep natural antechamber between the cabin wall and the outside world. Wind could howl across that opening and never touch the cabin walls. It would be like living behind a hill, and then behind a second hill, and then inside the hill itself. Ottilie finished her sketch. They both looked at it for a moment. She said quietly, not looking up, "The land doesn't fight you. It teaches you if you're humble enough to learn." James looked at her. She explained. Her father had said it on an Ohio winter night when she was 12 years old, and the family did not have enough wood to last until morning. He had said it while explaining to her why he was not afraid, how he had already thought through 3 ways to solve the problem, using what the house itself could tell them. Her father had not lived to see the spring of that year. James reached out and picked up the stick he had been drawing with. In the corner of the dirt diagram, he wrote the sentence out in careful surveyor's letters. He did not say anything he did not need to. The first Sunday, Ezra Coltrane brought his audience. Orson Pemberton was among them. Pemberton was the largest landowner in the county. His ranch ran to thousands of acres. His barn, 2 stories of oak framing with a gambrel roof, had cost $15,000 and was considered the finest agricultural structure in the territory. He had built it because the best barn in the territory was a statement, and Orson Pemberton was a man who made statements. He sat on his horse at the top of the limestone slope and looked down at James and Ottilie, who were clearing loose rock from the cave floor, with a methodical patience that Pemberton found in a way he could not quite articulate unsettling. "I've got a barn cost $15,000 Callaway," he called down. 2 stories, oak frame, best in the territory. He let that sit for a moment. "You really think you'll live better than a badger in a rock?" James set his shovel down. He looked up at Pemberton with the expression of a man who has long since made his peace with not being understood. "Time will tell, Mr. Pemberton." Pemberton laughed. The people who had come with him laughed. It was a good laugh, easy and warm and completely certain of itself. The name that came out of that afternoon was Callaway's Folly. Pemberton said it first as a joke. By the following Sunday, it had become the name everyone used. Merritt Holbrook came on his own without an invitation on a Tuesday morning in late July. He was the most respected builder in Endurance, which meant something in a town where most of what stood had been built in the last 4 years. He had put up 17 of the town's structures, including the schoolhouse and the bank. He had opinions about construction that were informed by genuine expertise, and he expressed them with the directness of a man who has been proven right enough times to trust his own judgment completely. He walked through the cave entrance, stood in the space where the cabin would be, looked at the cave ceiling and shook his head. "You're setting your foundation directly on Mother Rock," he said, not accusatory, analytical. "There's no settlement. A structure needs to settle." James started to explain about foundation stability and rock versus soil. Merritt had heard enough. "And you're running a flue pipe through a rock fissure." He pointed at the crack in the ceiling that James had identified as the chimney root. "That's asking for a chimney fire. Creosote builds in irregular spaces. This is not how it's done." "The fissure is 40 feet of natural draft," James said. It will pull cleaner than any brick chimney you've ever built. And the width means less creosote accumulation, not more. Holbrook raised one hand in the gesture of a man who has stopped listening. A square house on flat ground, that's what works. He was not malicious. He was utterly certain which in the long run causes the same damage. Philomena Holbrook Merritt's wife came 3 days later. She pulled her wagon up to the cave entrance and sat for a moment looking at Ottilie, who was hand-playing boards for the cabin floor, with her father's tools, working with the focused economy of someone who has done this kind of work before. Philomena got down. She stood at the cave entrance with her hands folded in front of her. "Ottilie," she said, her voice was genuinely kind. "That was the worst part. You're too smart for this. Come to town. Merritt will help James find a proper lot, something with good soil." Ottilie stopped planing. She looked at Philomena across the cave floor. "We've decided, Philomena. When winter comes," Philomena said, "remember that I offered." She got back in her wagon and drove away. Ottilie watched the wagon until it disappeared around the base of the hill. Then she picked up the plane and went back to work. Dorothea Alcott, the school teacher, did not come to the cave. She found another way to make her opinion known. In her classroom, in a lesson on the progress of civilization, she used the Callaway Project as an example of sentimental primitivism. She did not use James or Ottilie's name directly. She did not need to. Her students knew exactly who she meant. Ottilie learned about it in the general store from one of Dorothea's students, who repeated the phrase without realizing who Ottilie was. The phrase was a failure to embrace the progress of civilization. Ottilie thanked the child politely and walked home. The new term for foolish overcomplication to Callaway's something emerged from the schoolyard within a week and migrated to the saloon within 2. Ottilie heard it applied to a man who had tried to fix a wagon wheel using 5 steps when 2 would have done. James heard it from a child. He was walking back from checking the progress of a lumber delivery when a group of boys ran past. One of them pointed up toward the limestone hill and said it to another, explaining what the word meant, using Callaway's cave as the demonstration. The boy did not see the man whose name he was using standing 5 meters away. James walked the rest of the way home without stopping. He sat down at the work table inside the half-finished cabin and looked at his drawings for a long time. Ottilie put dinner on the table beside him. She did not ask what had happened. She had heard enough of it herself to know what his silence meant. He ate without tasting it. Later, after Ottilie was asleep, he went and sat at the cave entrance and looked at the lights of Endurance a mile away across the dark prairie. He was not having second thoughts about the design. He had tested every principle he was working from. The physics did not care about public opinion. He was having a different kind of thought. He was thinking about what it cost to be right in a way that no one around you could see yet. He was thinking about Ottilie, who had not chosen this battle, who had joined it because she believed in him, and who was now absorbing laughter that was meant for him. He sat there for a long time. Then he went inside and checked every joint in the wall framing one more time, the way a man does when he cannot sleep but can still work. The cabin was finished in early October. 4 months of work, just the 2 of them, in copper, who pulled logs from a ponderosa forest 16 kilometers north. James cut every mortise and tenon joint by hand. Ottilie planed every board. The double walls were stuffed with raw wool from a sheep farmer who sold it to them cheap because he had more of it than he knew what to do with. The stove cost $100. The chimney pipe ran up through the fissure to a stone cap James spent 3 days building on top of the cliff face. The root cellar was blasted from softer stone at the back of the cave with carefully placed charges. The 3 animal stalls were built with the same precision as the cabin itself. The total cost, including land registration, came to just under $2,000. They moved in on the 1st of October. Ezra Coltrane held a Sunday excursion that week, his largest attendance of the summer, billing it as a chance to see the finished product before the cold exposed its failures. 18 people came. They stood in the cave entrance and looked at the cabin with expressions that ranged from genuine curiosity to elaborate amusement. Coltrane said loudly, and to no one in particular, "Give them a real winter, then we'll see." The first real cold came at the end of October. While the last of the summer heat had made the inside of every frame house in Endurance suffocating, the cave had held at 12 degrees without any fire at all. When the nights dropped to freezing and then below, the small stove burned for 1 hour in the morning and 1 in the evening, the cabin settled into a steady 18 degrees. The cord of firewood stacked in the cave antechamber barely seemed to diminish. The Sunday excursions stopped. Not because Coltrane had given up, but because watching a cave do nothing dramatic was less satisfying as entertainment than it had been in the summer. One evening in early November, a folded piece of paper was pushed under the cabin door. Ottilie found it in the morning. She unfolded it, read it, and held it for a moment. It said, "Leave before the snow. This isn't a home. It's a grave." There was no signature. She folded it again and put it in the stove. James asked her what it was. "Nothing that matters," she said. She went to make breakfast. James looked at the stove where the paper was already becoming ash and did not press her. That night, after Ottilie was asleep, he went to the cave entrance again. The temperature outside was dropping toward -10. He could see the lights of Endurance to the south steady and ordinary. He thought about the 14 people who had laughed at the word badger and the 6 who had said cave in a tone that meant failure, and the one person who had pushed a threatening note under his door rather than say it to his face. He thought 62 days to first frost. They had said that in July as a joke. The frost had come and gone, and the cabin was warm, and the firewood was plentiful, and nothing had gone wrong. An old farmer had stopped by 2 weeks ago and said offhandedly as though commenting on the weather, 47 days to February. February's the killer month here. He had not meant anything particular by it. He had just been a man talking about Dakota winters. James stood at the entrance of the cave and looked at the dark prairie and thought about February. He went inside. He checked every chink in the cabin walls, every seal around the window frames, every stone in the chimney cap that he had built on top of the cliff. He checked the latches on the animal stall doors. He felt the temperature of the water in the storage barrels. He noted that the root vegetables in the cellar were firm and dry and showed no sign of rot. Everything was as it should be. He went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the wind beginning to pick up outside far away somewhere to the north. He was ready. He just did not know yet what he was ready for. The cow nearly died on a Tuesday. That was the thing no one in Endurance ever knew. They knew about the blizzard. They knew about the 27 people. They knew about the thermometer that read 17 degrees while the world outside was ending. But they never knew about the Tuesday in December when Ottilie Calloway spent a night on a cold stone floor talking to a sick animal in the dark, because that was the kind of detail that belonged to the people who had lived it, not to the people who later built stories around it. The cow had cost them nearly $400, which was close to a third of what remained of their savings after the land, the materials, and the stove. James had bought her from a farmer east of town in September, a solid brown Holstein who gave 3 gallons a day and had shown no sign of weakness through the autumn transition into the cave stall. But December brought a drop in temperature that happened faster than any previous cold of the season, and somewhere in the adjustment of rations and the change in the quality of the hay, the cow stopped eating. James found her standing in the far corner of the stall on a Wednesday morning, her head low, not touching the feed he had put out the night before. He stood at the stall gate for a long moment. He did not call Ottilie immediately. He went through the checklist in his head the way a man does when he is hoping the problem is small enough to solve before anyone else has to know about it. Temperature in the cave fine. Water available. Hay present. The cow simply was not eating it. He called Ottilie. She came in from the cabin, looked at the animal for about 4 seconds and said, "Go heat water, not boiling, warm." He did not ask questions, he went. What followed was a night that Ottilie would not describe in detail to anyone for the rest of her life. She mixed warm water with a small amount of salt and molasses, coaxed it into the cow, with a patience that had no bottom to it, covered the animal with 2 of their good wool blankets, and sat on the stone floor of the cave stall in the dark talking in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular. James brought her tea at midnight, and again at 3 in the morning, and both times she waved him back to bed, though she knew he was not sleeping. At 4 in the morning, the cow's breathing changed, slower, more regular. She turned her head and looked at Ottilie with the mild incomprehension of an animal that has been ill and is now, without understanding why, beginning to feel better. Ottilie came out of the stall and leaned against the cave wall. James was sitting on the floor just outside his back against the stone awake. "She'll be fine," Ottilie said. "You sure?" "No, but she's breathing right." James nodded. He looked at his hands. He had spent the night going over every aspect of the winter feeding plan in his head, finding the gap he had not accounted for. The transition from summer to winter feed required more mineral supplement than he had provided a detail that no book on cave dwelling had mentioned, because no book on cave dwelling existed. He had learned it tonight from a sick cow in a way he would not forget. That was how knowledge actually worked. You built the best system you could from what you understood, and then the system taught you what you had missed. He went back to bed and lay in the dark. Audley said quietly, not looking toward him, "The land doesn't fight you, it teaches you if you're humble enough to learn." James was still for a long moment. "Your father was right," he said, about more things than he knew. He adjusted the feed the following morning. He said nothing to anyone in town. But Ezra Coltrane had been driving past on the road below the cliff that morning, early on his way to collect a delivery. He had seen the lamplight burning in the cave opening at 4 in the morning, which was unusual, and he had drawn the conclusion that any man of his disposition would draw something had gone wrong. By afternoon, he had mentioned it to 3 people. By evening, the story had grown into a structural crack in the cave wall, or possibly a fire, or possibly both. Merritt Holbrook heard it in the saloon and said nothing. Philomena Holbrook heard it from a neighbor and said to no one in particular, but loudly enough to be heard, "I told Audley." James learned what was being said 2 days later from a man who mentioned it while buying rope at the hardware counter Coltrane had set up in his store. The man said it without malice, the way people repeat things they have heard without considering whether the hearing was accurate. James thanked him and walked home. He did not tell Audley what was being said. Audley already knew. December settled into a cold that was steady rather than dramatic. The kind of cold that did not arrive in storms, but simply descended and stayed sitting on the prairie, like a judgment that had decided to take its time. In the cave, the system ran as designed. The stove burned its 2 hours daily, and the cabin held its temperature. The root cellar kept the carrots and turnips and potatoes as fresh as the day they had been stored, the constant 7-degree temperature, doing the work of a refrigerator that would not be invented for another generation. Copper, recovered from the cow scare and eating well on the adjusted rations, stood calm in his stall with the particular contentment of an animal that has found a place where nothing threatens it. James used the quiet weeks of mid-December to do something he had been planning since October. He walked every meter of rope line he intended to string from the cave entrance to the main road, in the event of a severe storm, testing the anchor points in the frozen ground, replacing 2 that had shifted. A blizzard that produced 0 visibility required a physical guide, something a man could follow with his hands when his eyes were useless. He drove the stakes deep and tested each one by pulling against it with his full weight. Audley watched him do this from the cave entrance one afternoon without comment. It was the kind of preparation that made no sense to explain to anyone, because the explaining required first convincing someone that a storm bad enough to eliminate visibility was actually possible, and that conversation had already been tried and lost in November. One evening in the middle of December, old Gideon Sherwood appeared at the cave entrance with a bottle of whiskey that had seen better days and the expression of a man who has come to say something and is not entirely sure how to say it. Sherwood was 70 years old and had been hunting and trapping in Dakota since before the railroad came through. He had no wife, no children that he acknowledged, and no need for the opinion of other people, which was perhaps why his opinion was the only one in the county that James Calloway had ever found worth hearing. He had been the one back in August who had looked at the cave entrance and the limestone cliff and said simply, "You picked a good rock, Calloway." No explanation, no qualification, just the observation of a man who knew what he was looking at. They sat at the cave entrance with the whiskey between them and looked out at the snow-covered prairie in the last of the afternoon light. Sherwood did not begin immediately. He drank once, handed the bottle to James, and looked north for a long time. "I seen a winter in '73 that took 11 men," he said finally. 3 of them experienced. Men who knew what they were doing. He paused. "Signs this year are the same as that year." James looked at him. "You sure?" "No." Sherwood took the bottle back. "But I'm stacking more wood." He stood up slowly, the way old men stand when their joints have opinions about the weather that their minds have not yet acknowledged. "February's 23 days out, Calloway. Do what you need to do." He walked away into the early dark without looking back. James sat at the cave entrance for a long time after Sherwood left. He thought about 11 men. He thought about what it meant that Sherwood, who had seen 30 Dakota winters and who did not traffic in exaggeration, had come in person rather than simply stacking his own wood and saying nothing. He made a decision. If the signs came to their conclusion, if the barometer did what he suspected it might do in the weeks ahead, he would go into town and tell people what was coming. Not because he expected to be believed, because it was the only decent thing to do. The thing about Orson Pemberton that most people in endurance did not understand was that he had not always been the man on the horse looking down at other people's work. He had come to the territory 14 years earlier with $120 in a draft horse and had built what he had through a combination of genuine intelligence and a willingness to work that few men could match. The intelligence had served him well until it had calcified into certainty, which is the stage at which intelligence stops being useful and starts being a liability. On an afternoon in late December, Pemberton rode past the limestone cliff on his way back from the eastern section of his range. He slowed his horse without intending to. He had not meant to look. But the woodpile stacked against the inner wall of the cave antechamber was visible from the road, and something about it stopped him. He sat on his horse and looked at it. The Callaway woodpile was nearly full. It was mid-December, and they had been living in the cave since October, and the woodpile was nearly full. Pemberton's own woodpile back at the ranch had been reduced by a third. He burned through more in a bad week than Callaway appeared to have burned in 2.5 months. He rode directly to Ezra Coltrane's store. He found Coltrane behind the counter doing inventory, which was a thing Coltrane did when he wanted to look occupied without being required to do anything else. "How much wood does Callaway have left?" Pemberton asked. Coltrane looked up. "More than you." "That can't be right." "I know," Coltrane said, "but it is." Pemberton put both hands flat on the counter. He was not angry, which was unusual for him when things did not conform to his expectations. He was something more uncomfortable than angry. He was in the early stages of a doubt he did not have a name for yet. He ordered an additional 2 cords of firewood from Coltrane's winter supply and rode home without eating supper. His wife asked him what was wrong. He told her nothing. He sat in his chair that evening and stared at the fire in his expensive stone fireplace and did not tell her that he had spent 20 minutes doing arithmetic in his head, and the arithmetic kept coming out the same way. He told no one about the arithmetic. There was not yet in his vocabulary or his self-concept a way to say, "I may have been looking at this incorrectly." January passed in the way that January passes in Dakota Territory, when nothing catastrophic is happening slowly and with a cold that becomes ordinary because the alternative is not being able to function. James drove new anchor stakes for the rope line when the old ones shifted in a January thaw. Oddly organized the root cellar by the rate at which things would be needed, putting the things they would want first in February nearest the door. In town, life continued in the way it always did with the modifications that winter required. Merritt Holbrook worked on indoor jobs. Dorothea Alcott kept her classroom heated with the school board's budget, which meant the students were warm and the budget was not. Ezra Coltrane ran his store. Orson Pemberton managed his ranch from inside the house as much as possible and did not mention his arithmetic to anyone. The Sunday excursions to Callaway's Folly had ended entirely. Without new drama to observe, there was nothing to see but 2 people going about their lives in an unusual location, and that was not enough to sustain an audience. But the word Callaway was still being used as a verb in the saloon. Dorothea Alcott had used it once more in a lesson apparently without conscious thought, as naturally as if it had always been part of the language. One of her students had told Ottilie about it again, without realizing who Ottilie was in relation to the word being used. Ottilie had thanked the child and walked home. She had not mentioned it to James. But that evening she had sat for a long time after dinner, looking at the sentence written in his surveyor's hand, in the margin of the construction drawings, the sentence her father had spoken in an Ohio winter, the year he died. And she had felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but occupied the space where both of them lived. She had decided something during that evening of looking at the drawings. She had decided that she was done being quietly dignified about it. Not that she intended to become loud. Only that the quiet was costing her something she had not agreed to spend, and it was time to stop spending it. She said nothing to James about this decision. She simply, in the weeks that followed, began to carry herself in a way that was different. Anyone watching closely might have noticed the difference. In endurance, no one was watching closely enough. The morning of February 8th was the morning James Callaway's barometer told him something he had never seen a barometer say before. He kept it on the shelf above the work table, a quality instrument he had bought from a scientific supply catalog in Bismarck, paying more than he should have given their budget because 8 years of surveying had taught him that accurate instruments were not a luxury but a survival tool. The town had found the purchase funny, a farmer with a barometer. What next, they had said, a telegraph to the moon. He checked it every morning as a part of a routine that had become as automatic as checking the stove temperature. On the morning of February 8th, he put his coffee down on the table and looked at the needle and stood very still. In 8 years with the Northern Pacific crossing mountains and rivers and every variety of Dakota plain, he had never seen the barometer drop this fast. It had fallen overnight while he slept. By his estimate, it had been dropping since before midnight. He went to the cave entrance and looked at the sky. The prairie birds that usually moved at dawn were not there. Not a single one. The air had the quality he could only describe to himself as electric, though the temperature was ordinary. And the horizon to the west was the color of an old bruised yellowish gray, the kind of sky that appeared in exactly one context in his experience. He went back inside. He looked at the barometer again. He did not need to recalculate. "How long?" Ottilie asked from across the room. She had been watching him since he put his coffee down. "Less than 30 hours, he said. Maybe less than 20. She nodded once, the nod of a woman who has been preparing for exactly this conversation and is relieved to finally be having it. "Go tell them," she said. "I'll start on the water barrels." He saddled Copper and rode into Endurance. He found Merritt Holbrook at the lumber yard checking a delivery that had come in the previous afternoon. "A big one's coming," James said. "The worst I've seen signs of. You should bank your fires and check your roofs before tonight." Merritt looked at the sky, which was still mostly clear in the early morning. He looked back at James with the expression of a man who has heard something he would like to believe, but cannot quite get there. "It's winter in Dakota Callaway," he said. "It's always cold." A pause that was meant to be kind, but was not quite. "Don't scare yourself in that hole of yours." James held Copper still. He said, "Merritt, I am not asking you to understand why I'm certain. I am asking you to check your roof and bank your fires before tonight." Holbrook looked at him for a moment. The history between them lived in that moment, all of it. Then he turned back to his lumber delivery. James rode toward the school. Dorothea Alcott was on the steps watching two students carry books inside. She saw him coming and waited with the patience of a woman who has learned that men on horses sometimes have things to say that need to be heard standing still. "Keep the children inside tomorrow, Mrs. Alcott," he said, "all day, whatever the sky looks like." She looked up at the sky, clear and ordinary. "Is this another one of your theories, Mr. Callaway?" Not unkind, genuinely curious with a layer of something beneath it that might have been the beginning of doubt or might only have been politeness. "The Platte River looked fine the morning before the flood of '81, he said. "I was there." He rode on before she could respond. He passed Ezra Coltrane's store without stopping. He looked through the window and saw Coltrane behind the counter serving two customers, gesturing with the ease of a man who is comfortable and believes he will continue to be. James looked at him for perhaps 2 seconds and then looked back at the road. He turned Copper north toward the cliff. On the way, he stopped at Gideon Sherwood's cabin. The door was locked from the inside. The drifted snow at the base of the steps showed tracks leading in, but not out, and the tracks were old enough to have crusted over. Sherwood had not left his cabin since at least the day before. James knocked. No answer came for a long moment. Then from inside, muffled by wood and distance, "Go home, Callaway." 3 words. The voice of a man who was already where he needed to be and had been there since yesterday, which told James everything the barometer had not already said. He rode home. Ottilie had filled every barrel, every bucket, every pot in the cave by the time he returned. She did not ask him how the conversations in town had gone. She could read the answer in the way he unsaddled Copper and put him in the stall with extra hay and extra water without being asked. He spent the afternoon checking the rope line one final time, driving the last 2 stakes with a methodical force that went beyond necessity into something that was closer to prayer. He checked the cabin window seals. He tested the door latch. He went over the food stores and did the arithmetic, 12 days at their current consumption rate with margin. As the sun went down, he stood at the cave entrance and looked at the lights of Endurance one more time. The town looked the same as it always did at dusk. Smoke rising from the chimney's windows going yellow as lamps were lit, the ordinary machinery of 400 people ending their ordinary day. Merritt Holbrook was in there somewhere, probably having supper. Orson Pemberton was at his ranch, the best barn in the territory, standing 2 stories tall against the coming dark. Dorothea Alcott was at home with her books. James stood and looked at the town and felt the weight of what he knew and could not make anyone believe. He was not angry. Anger required the belief that the situation could have been different, that one more conversation or one better chosen word could have changed the outcome. He had been a surveyor long enough to know that some distances are what they are, and measuring them more precisely does not make them shorter. He went inside. He checked the door latch one final time. Then he went to bed. Ottilie was already lying down, her eyes open in the dark. At 10 o'clock, Copper stopped chewing. James heard it in the silence that followed the absence of the ordinary sound that had become as familiar as breathing. He was not asleep. He lay still and listened. Then he heard it. The cow who had been moving softly in the stall went still. The two goats went still. Three animals. The same moment. Facing all of them, James knew without seeing north. Ottilie was already sitting up. She got up and went to the door and opened it, and the night came in. Not cold exactly. Still. The kind of stillness that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that has not yet decided to speak. She looked at the sky. No stars. A darkness that was not quite normal darkness. She stood for perhaps 10 seconds. Then she came inside and put her back against the door and pulled the oak bolt home, the 7-centimeter hardwood door, seating into its frame with a sound like a decision that could not be unmade. "It's coming," she said. From across the cabin, James was already pulling on his boots. "I know," he said. The candle on the table burned straight and still. At 3:17 the following afternoon, the sky opened. The temperature, which had been sitting at a reasonable -5, dropped 22 degrees in 20 minutes. The snow did not fall. It attacked, driven horizontal from the north by winds that hit 110 kilometers per hour at their first arrival and did not slow. Visibility went from ordinary to zero in a time that could be measured in seconds. Inside Callaway's Folly, the candle did not move. In endurance, the sound hit first a physical wall of noise that people in their houses described afterward as the moment the world changed. The storm did not build. It arrived complete, as though it had been assembled somewhere to the north and transported intact to the Dakota Prairie. Orson Pemberton's barn was the largest single structure for 30 kilometers in any direction. Its north wall caught the driven snow the way a dam catches water. The drifts built with a speed that seemed impossible, 3 meters, then 4, then 5. By midnight of the first night, the weight was measurable in the groan of the roof trusses. Pemberton's hired men trapped in the ranch house heard it through the walls. In the frame houses of endurance, the wind found what wind always finds in frame construction: every gap that had been acceptable in calm weather and became a conduit in a storm. Snow pushed through window casings, under doors. The chimneys, hit by horizontal wind, could not maintain their draw. Smoke backed into rooms. Families began burning wood at rates that their winter supplies had not been calculated for. Merritt Holbrook's house stood better than most because Holbrook had built it himself and had not cut corners on the joinery. But the chimney still faltered. The window frames still let in cold that could not be stopped without stopping light. His wife and children gathered in the warmest room and burned wood and waited. Inside the cave, James stoked the stove with a single piece of hardwood, and the temperature held at 17 degrees. The animals were calm. The candle on the table was still. He and Ottilie did not speak much in those first hours. They ate dinner. Ottilie mended a shirt. James reread his survey field journals from the Wyoming years by lamplight, looking at his own careful handwriting from a decade ago, the temperature observations that had started all of this. They were in the middle of a storm that was killing the prairie, having a quiet evening. They both knew it would not stay quiet. On the fourth night, at an hour closer to morning than to midnight, James heard a sound that was not the storm. He sat up. It was a tapping. Not from the door, which was on the south face of the cave entrance, but from along the eastern wall of the antechamber, lower than a standing man would make. The sound of something that had stopped at being able to use its hands properly and was using whatever it had left. James was out of bed before Ottilie was fully awake. He took the coil of rope from the wall hook, tied one end around his waist, and walked into the antechamber. The noise of the storm, even here in the protected space 6 meters behind the cave entrance, was a continuous physical pressure. Beyond the entrance, it was another world entirely. Merritt Holbrook was sitting on the floor just inside the cave entrance, his back against the wall. Eli half collapsed against him. They had made it through the entrance on their own, but had not had enough left to go further. Merritt was looking at the rope around James's waist with the dull recognition of a man who is still processing what he is seeing. James crouched down. "Can you walk?" Merritt nodded. It was not a confident nod, but it was a nod. James got Eli to his feet first, got one of the boy's arms around his shoulders, and moved him through the antechamber into the warmth of the cabin. Ottilie was already there with blankets. He went back for Merritt. Merritt Holbrook walked into the cabin under his own power. He stood in the middle of the room for a moment, looking at the candle that was not moving, at the thermometer on the wall, at Ottilie, covering his son with a second blanket, at James Calloway, standing in front of him, without any expression that resembled victory. He said 3 words that James already knew: "You were right." Then his hands began to shake. Ottilie put a bowl of broth into them and guided him to the chair by the stove. Outside, the storm continued, without any interest in what it had just set in motion. But something else had reached the cave in the darkness of that 4th night, and James had not yet found it. He went back to the antechamber to replace the rope on its hook. He held the lamp out and checked the entrance, as he had been doing every few hours since the storm began, looking for anyone else who might have followed the rope line. In the far corner of the antechamber, where the wall curved back toward the rock, something was lying on the floor. He brought the lamp closer. A man, not moving, face turned toward the stone, both hands tucked under his chest in the involuntary way of a person who has lost sensation in them and is trying by instinct to protect them. James set the lamp down and turned the man over. He held the lamp close to the face. It took him a moment. The cold distorts features, and the skin was mottled and white in the places it should not have been. But he knew the face. He had been looking at it across a counter for 8 years. Ezra Coltrane. James stayed very still for a count of 3. 3 seconds in which the full history of everything Coltrane had done passed through him without ceremony. The double pricing, the crowds on Sunday, the loan of his platform to every piece of mockery that the town had been pleased to perform. 3 seconds. Then he got his arms under Coltrane's shoulders and dragged him into the light and warmth of the cabin without saying a word about who it was. Ottilie came and looked at the man on the floor. She looked at James. He met her eyes, and she saw in them everything that he was not going to say about this moment. She went and got the last spare blanket and knelt down beside Ezra Coltrane. The storm did not stop. It had 4 more days of business left to conduct in Dakota Territory, and it intended to conduct all of it. Ezra Coltrane did not speak for 6 hours. He drifted in and out of something that was not quite sleep and not quite unconsciousness, his body doing the slow, painful work of reclaiming itself from the cold. Ottilie kept the blanket tight around him and checked his hands every hour for the color that would mean the damage was permanent. The color stayed at the edge of acceptable. She did not tell him how close it had been. Merritt Holbrook and his son Eli sat against the far wall of the cabin, wrapped in their own blankets, watching. Eli had recovered faster than his father, the resilience of 17 working in his favor. Merritt was still pale in a way that went beyond the surface, the pallor of a man who has been shaken at the foundation of something he believed was solid. James kept the stove fed and said little. The storm made its noise on the other side of the cave walls, and the candle on the table kept burning straight. When Coltrane's eyes finally opened and stayed open, he did not immediately understand where he was. Then he did. You could see the understanding move across his face in layers, each one arriving separately. Warmth sheltered the faces of people he knew, and then the specific face of Ottilie Calloway, who was sitting beside him, doing mending with the calm of a woman who has decided that everything requiring a reaction can wait until later. He looked at the thermometer on the wall. He looked at the candle. He looked at his own hands, which Ottilie had wrapped in strips of flannel. Then he looked at Ottilie and said in a voice that had no performance left in it, "You know what I did." Ottilie set her mending down. She did not look away from him. "I know. The double pricing, the Sundays." A pause. "I brought people to laugh." "I know," Ottilie said again. Her voice was not warm and it was not cold. It was simply the voice of a woman who has decided to be honest because nothing else makes sense anymore. "You were protecting your business. I understood that from the beginning." Coltrane looked at his wrapped hands. "Why did he come out for me?" Ottilie was quiet for a moment. When she answered, she was looking at him with an attention that was not unkind, but was not forgiving either. Not yet, because forgiveness requires more than a single honest conversation. "Because that's who he is," she said. "Not because you deserved it." Coltrane closed his eyes. He did not say anything else for a long time. But something in the set of his face had changed the way a structure changes when a wall that has been holding tension is finally allowed to release it. In the corner, Merritt Holbrook had heard every word. He looked at his son and then away again, out at the cave wall, thinking about something that was not in the room. The 5th day brought more people. They came along the rope line that James had driven into frozen ground in October. The stakes he had tested with his full body weight because he did not know exactly what he was preparing for but understood that preparation was not something you did halfway. They came one at a time and in small groups materializing at the cave entrance, with the particular quality of people who have survived something and are not yet certain how. Mayor Prescott Dunmore arrived in the late morning of the fifth day. His face had the mottled redness of frostbite in the early stages, the skin around his nose and the tops of his ears gone a color that was going to cost him some discomfort in the weeks ahead. One corner of his roof had come down under the accumulated weight of snow on the second night, and he had spent 2 days in a house that was open to the storm on one side, burning everything combustible he owned. He walked into the cave with the stiff movement of a man who is in more pain than he is showing. He looked at the cabin inside the cave, at the people already there at the thermometer, at James Calloway standing near the stove. He said nothing immediately. There was nothing in the grammar of being a small-town mayor that covered this specific situation. He went and sat near the warmth and accepted the cup of broth that Ottilie put in his hands. Dorothea Alcott came on the evening of the sixth day. She came last because she had been the last to decide, and she came with 3 students because she had been the one who stayed with them when their parents could not reach the school before the storm sealed the town. She had done exactly what James had told her to do, which was keep the children inside. And the fact that she had done it as a precaution rather than a conviction did not change the outcome for 3 families who still had their children at the end of that week. She came through the cave entrance with her hand on the shoulder of the smallest child, a girl of perhaps 8, who was not crying, but had the face of a child who has been holding herself together through an act of sustained will. Dorothea moved the girl into the cabin first, then the other 2 children, then stood in the antechamber for a moment before following them. Ottilie caught her in the moment between the cold and the warmth in the space where a person's face shows what it actually is before social habit reassembles it. Dorothea looked at Ottilie. "The children," she said, "are they safe?" "Everyone here is safe," Ottilie said, and guided her inside. Families came in 2s and 3s through the 6th and 7th days. James had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since the storm began. He organized sleeping arrangements with the methodical efficiency of a man accustomed to managing logistics in difficult terrain, rationed the food stores against the increasing headcount, kept the stove fed, checked the rope line twice daily by feel. He did not assign himself credit for any of it. He simply identified what needed doing and did it the way he had always done work. On the 7th day in the early afternoon, Orson Pemberton came. He came alone. His hired men had managed the ranch on their own, huddled in the bunkhouse with enough provisions to outlast the storm, but Pemberton had not been willing to shelter there with them. He had spent 7 days in his main house burning his fireplace at a rate that consumed the season's wood supply in 3 days, and then moved on to the furniture and then to the interior wall paneling of 2 rooms. His barn, the $15,000 monument, had lost its east section on the 4th day. He had heard it go from inside the house, a sound like the territory itself giving up on something. He had come out when he calculated that going was safer than staying. He had followed the rope line from the road. When he walked through the cave entrance, 26 people were already in the cave. They all saw him come in. No one said anything. Pemberton stood in the antechamber and looked at the 26 people who had arrived before him, some of whom he had been employing, some of whom he had ignored, all of whom he had in various ways situated himself above. He held his hat in his hands. The hat was expensive and had been crushed by 7 days of repeated handling. He did not speak. He walked to the area near the stove where space had been left, as though the cave had been expecting him, and sat down. He put the hat in his lap. He looked at the fire visible through the stove's small grate. James looked at him from across the room. Pemberton did not meet his eyes, not yet. He was not ready for that exchange. He needed a few more hours of being warm first. James looked away and went back to the work of managing 27 people through a blizzard. On the 6th night, Merritt Holbrook could not sleep. He sat against the wall in the space that had been assigned to him and Eli and looked at the small stove with the focused attention of a man who is trying to understand something that has been in front of him for months without being visible. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket, a pencil from another pocket. In the limited light from the stove and the lamp, Ottilie had left burning low. He began to write down what he could observe: the temperature, the wood consumption, The time elapsed, the number of people being kept warm. He was not a sentimental man, and he did not approach the numbers sentimentally. He approached them the way a builder approaches a structure that has outperformed everything he thought he knew about construction, with the specific humility of a professional whose professional judgment has been proven wrong. James noticed him writing and came and sat across from him without being invited. Merritt did not look up immediately. Then your flu draws perfectly how James was quiet for a moment. He thought about how to say it so that it became a picture rather than a lecture. The fissure goes 40 feet straight up through solid rock, he said. When the wind runs across the top of the cliff, it creates a low-pressure zone at the top of the fissure. That pulls the smoke upward harder than any brick chimney could manage, especially in a storm when the wind is strongest. The bigger the storm, the better the draft. Merritt wrote this down. He looked at what he had written. Then he stood up and walked into the antechamber where the lamp threw enough light to see the cave wall. He put his hand flat against the limestone. The stone was cool, not cold. From the inside, the temperature of the earth itself steady and indifferent to the catastrophe happening 60 meters away on the open prairie. He stood there with his hand on the rock for a long time. Then he said it. Not to James, who was standing a few steps behind him. Not to anyone in particular. He said it the way a man says something when he has finally arrived at a place he should have reached much earlier, and the lateness of the arrival is part of what the saying means. The land doesn't fight you, Merritt Holbrook said. It teaches you if you're humble enough to learn. James was still. Merritt turned around. Ottilie said it when we came in. He looked at the wall where his hand had been. Where does that come from? Her father, James said. He said it in a winter when they didn't have enough wood. Merritt looked at him. Did he survive it? No. Merritt was quiet for a moment, but she remembered it. She remembered it? Merritt looked back at the cave wall. He wrote the sentence down in his small notebook in the careful letters of a man who intends to keep what he is writing. It should be over every door in this territory, he said. James did not respond. He stood in the lamplight of the antechamber with 7 days of no sleep behind him and 27 people in the cave behind the wall and the storm still working outside, and felt something that he could not have named if asked, but that lived in the chest in the region where a man keeps the things that matter most. The storm ended on the morning of the 8th day. It did not taper. It stopped the way a machine stops when the mechanism is done, leaving a silence so complete and so sudden that several people in the cave woke from sleep because the noise they had learned to sleep through was gone. James was already awake. He had been awake for most of the night, listening to the storm lose energy by increments, the way a man who has been reading weather for 8 years can hear a system exhausting itself. At 7 in the morning, he went to the cave entrance and pushed the heavy door open. The light that came in was the flat, brilliant white of a world that has been remade overnight. The snow was sculpted into shapes that had no precedent, towering forms that curved and overhanged and tapered in ways that looked architectural, as though the storm had been trying to build something of its own. The sky above it was a blue so clean and cold it seemed to belong to a different planet than the gray mass that had occupied it for 8 days. Endurance was gone, not destroyed, buried. The roof lines of the nearest buildings were visible above the snow, and a few chimneys showed, and here and there a window on an upper story. The town had not ceased to exist. It had simply been covered, waiting to be dug out. James stood in the cave entrance for a long time. Then he went back inside and began organizing the search. They found 12 people who had not survived. James learned each name as the day went on, as the teams he organized moved through the drifts with shovels, working outward from the places they knew people had been. 2 of Pemberton's hired hands who had tried to reach the cattle in the barn on the second night and had not found their way back. An elderly couple on the eastern edge of town whose chimney had failed on the first night and whose house had held no heat. Others scattered each with a story that fit into the larger story of what happened when a system built to manage ordinary winter met something that was not ordinary. James took each name and held it. He had been right. He had built correctly. He had prepared correctly. He had gone into town and given warning that had not been received but had still been given. He had done everything that could be done, and 12 people had still died. There was no resolution to this. He understood that. There was no position he could arrange himself into, no sentence he could say to himself that would make the arithmetic of it acceptable. He had not caused the deaths. He had not been able to prevent them either. Not all of them, not the ones who had been too far or too proud or simply unlucky in which direction they had moved on the wrong night. He sat at the cave entrance in the middle of the afternoon, the search team still moving in the distance, and looked at the white expanse of what had been a functioning town. Ottilie came and sat beside him. She did not say anything. She put her hand on his hand and left it there. After a long time, he said, 12. I know, she said. I went to them. I know you did. The snow threw light back at the sky in every direction. The afternoon was very quiet. Somewhere in the middle distance, a team of men was digging out a house with a methodical persistence that made a small sound, the scrape of shovels on packed snow that traveled a long way in the still air. The man on the east road, James said, Henderson, I bought rope from him twice. Ottilie did not answer. She knew that there was nothing to answer. They sat together until the cold began to matter again. The apologies came over the following week as the town dug itself out, and the reality of what had happened settled into the particular shape that surviving a catastrophe always takes a combination of grief and practicality, because the grieving and the practical work have to happen at the same time, and neither can wait for the other. Orson Pemberton came to the cave entrance on the fourth day after the storm. He stood with his hat in his hands as he had stood inside the cave during the storm, and he looked at James with the eyes of a man who has spent 4 days composing what he is about to say and has arrived at the conclusion that no composition will be adequate. I owe you an apology, he said. His voice was not the voice he used when he sat on his horse looking down at things. It was a different voice entirely. I called your work folly. I gave it that name and I let it stick. This folly saved 27 lives. A pause, boy. Mine included. I was wrong, completely wrong. I called you a fool, and you were the only man in this county who built with any wisdom. James looked at him. It doesn't matter now, Mr. Pemberton. You're safe. That's what matters. Pemberton heard the grace in the response and understood what it was costing. He nodded once, replaced his hat, and walked back down the slope. Merritt Holbrook came the same afternoon with his notebook. He did not begin with an apology. He began with a question which was for Merritt a form of apology. Would you let me take some measurements I need to understand the principles fully, not just the parts I could observe from inside? He held up the notebook. I've been building houses to fight the prairie. That's how I was trained. That's what I've done for 15 years. He stopped. You built one that cooperates with it. I need to learn how to do that. I'll teach you everything I know, James said. He meant it completely. They spent 2 hours in the cave that afternoon, James explaining and Merritt writing the transfer of knowledge going from one man to another in the way that real knowledge always transfers, not as a lecture, but as a conversation between two people who are both trying to understand something larger than either of them. Dorothea Alcott came on the 5th day in the early evening when the light was going amber and the snow was developing the blue shadows of late afternoon. She did not go to James, she went to Ottilie. She sat down beside Ottilie at the work table where Ottilie was inventorying the remaining food stores, and she sat quietly for a moment before speaking. I told my students that what you were doing represented a failure to embrace civilization's progress, she said. I used those words in a classroom. Ottilie continued writing in the inventory ledger. She did not look up. I was teaching them that intelligence means following the established method, Dorothea continued. That civilization is the accumulation of correct techniques and that deviating from them is a kind of regression. She stopped. What you and James did is the opposite of that. Civilization at its best is the accumulation of understanding. You understood something the rest of us didn't, and you had the patience to act on it even when everyone around you was making it as difficult as possible. She looked at her hands. I was teaching them the wrong lesson. Ottilie set her pencil down. She looked at Dorothea. My father knew it, Ottilie said. He was a carpenter. He understood that the land has things to teach and that the teaching is available to anyone willing to sit still long enough to receive it. She paused. I just didn't forget what he told me. Dorothea looked at her for a moment. You were carrying his lesson. I was, Ottilie said. The hard part was that I couldn't put it down even when it would have been easier to. They sat together for a while in a silence that was different from any silence that had existed between them before. Philomena Holbrook came the following morning when Ottilie was outside clearing the antechamber entrance of the last accumulated drifts. She did not have a speech. Philomena Holbrook had never been a woman who prepared speeches. She stood beside Ottilie and picked up a second shovel that was leaning against the rock and began working without being asked. After a while, she said, I offered you the wrong thing. Audley kept shoveling. I offered you what I thought you needed, Philomena said. A proper lot, a frame house, the things that made sense to me. I didn't ask what you actually needed. You were being kind, Audley said. I was being certain, Philomena said, which is different. She worked for a moment. Merritt's different now. Whatever happened in there, whatever James said to him, he's different. He's been up all night, 3 nights in a row with that notebook. That's good, Audley said. It's very good, Philomena said. I just wanted you to know that I saw it, and that I understand now what I was actually offering you back in July, which was not kindness, but certainty, wearing kindness's clothes. They finished clearing the antechamber entrance together. When the work was done, they stood for a moment, side by side, looking out at the changed landscape. The prairie still white and vast and indifferent, and the town below beginning to show itself again as the shoveling continued. Philomena went home. Audley went back inside. That evening, Audley told James what Philomena had said. James listened. Then he said, "She's a straight-thinking woman." "She always was," Audley said. "She just needed a blizzard to show it." Ezra Coltrane found James alone in the antechamber 3 days after the storm ended. He had been staying in town recovering, and he had the look of a man who has been carrying a conversation around with him for days and has finally gotten tired of the wait. He stood in the antechamber with his hat off, which was becoming a common gesture among the men of endurance that week. "I cut your credit and brought people out here to laugh," he said. "Then you came out in the middle of that storm to pull me in." He looked at his hat, then back at James. "I don't know how to make that right." James thought about it as carefully before answering. He was aware that what he said here would either be the thing he actually believed or a performance of magnanimity, and he had no interest in performances. "Don't try to make it right with me, Coltrane," he said finally. "Make it right with the next man who tries something the town doesn't understand. When that man needs credit, give it to him. When people want to come and laugh, don't organize the excursion." Coltrane looked at him. The response was not what he had expected, which meant it was the right response. "I can do that," Coltrane said. James nodded. That was the end of the conversation. Coltrane put his hat back on and walked out into the cold afternoon. Inside the cabin, Audley had heard the exchange. She was in the back room doing something with the food stores, or she appeared to be. James came in and began stoking the stove. "Did you hear?" he asked. "Every word," she said. And she was quiet for a moment, long enough that he turned to look at her. "Ask me in a year," she said. He turned back to the stove. A year was not an unreasonable timeline for some things. Spring came to Endurance the way spring comes to the northern prairie, apologetically at first in false starts and reversals, and then all at once flooding the land with a warmth and color that made the winter seem like something that had happened in another life. Merritt Holbrook broke ground on the first structure built on Callaway principles that April. It was not a cave. It was a house built into the south-facing slope of a small rise east of town, its back wall resting against the earth that insulated it, its south face given over to windows that captured the low spring sun. He had drawn and redrawn the plans through March, consulting James twice a week in sessions that had moved from formal instruction into something more like a conversation between equals, two men working out the details of a method that neither of them had fully invented and that both of them were in the process of understanding. In his plans in the corner where a builder notes the method used, Merritt had written 2 words. James found it by accident 3 months after the storm when Merritt spread the plans on the work table to show a client. The 2 words were in Merritt's careful construction, lettering small and precise, and utterly without fanfare. Callaway method. James looked at those 2 words for a long moment. Merritt was talking to the client and did not notice James looking. James did not say anything. He set the edge of the plan back down where it had been and walked to the cave entrance and stood outside in the April air. The prairie was running with meltwater. The sky was the tentative blue of early spring. Below the cliff, the town of Endurance was visible in its entirety, no longer buried the scars of the winter apparent in the replaced roof lines, and the gaps where structures had been removed and apparent also in the newer shapes beginning to appear at the edges, the first signs of rebuilding that took account of what the winter had demonstrated. James stood there until he was ready to go back inside, then he went. By the following winter, 11 structures in the county had been built using the Callaway method in some form. Not all of them were built by Merritt Holbrook. The knowledge had distributed itself the way knowledge does when it has proven itself under the most rigorous test available, through conversation, through imitation, through the specific transmission that happens when one person shows another person something that works. Old Gideon Sherwood was among the last people James saw before spring made the whole question of surviving winter irrelevant for another 9 months. Sherwood came to the cave on a morning in late March without whiskey this time and stood in the cave entrance, looking at the interior the way he had stood there the previous summer, taking it in without comment. "How many in your count?" he asked. 27 in the cave, James said. 12 didn't make it. Sherwood was quiet for a moment. "Better than 73, he said. 11 that year in better conditions than this." He looked at James. "I knew you'd go out in the dark for them. Every one of them. That's why I didn't worry about you, Calloway." James looked at him. "You worried about everyone else." "Everyone else didn't have the sense to build into the rock," Sherwood said. He put his hat back on. "They do now, or they're starting to." He stepped back into the sunlight. "That'll do." He walked away down the slope without looking back, which was the way Sherwood ended every conversation he considered complete. Dorothea Alcott held class outdoors that April on a morning when the temperature had risen enough to make it possible moving the desks and benches onto the flat ground in front of the schoolhouse and conducting lessons in the open air, as though to make a point about the relationship between learning and the world that the learning was supposed to apply to. At the end of the morning session, she led her students on a walk to the limestone cliff. She did this without announcing it as a significant event, simply as the next thing they were going to do. They climbed the slope to the cave entrance, and she gathered them there and spoke to them in the matter-of-fact voice of someone presenting evidence. "This is where 27 people survived the Great Blizzard of 1884, she said. "Not because of luck, not because of accident, because one man understood something about how the land works and had the patience to act on that understanding for 7 months while the people around him told him he was wrong." She looked at the cave entrance. "And because his wife understood it too and did not flinch, not once." She turned back to the children. "That is what civilization actually looks like. Not the refusal to use a cave. The willingness to learn from what the land is already doing." None of her students fully understood what she was telling them. They were children, and the blizzard had been a winter ago, and they were more interested in the cave than in the lesson about it. But Dorothea knew from 20 years of teaching that the words went in anyway. They went in and they stayed, and 10 years from now, or 30 years from now, some of them would find themselves in a situation that required them to remember something true and useful, and the words would be there. Old Gideon Sherwood was standing at the back of the group. He had not been invited. He had simply been walking past, or so he appeared to be. He watched Dorothea finish speaking and watched the children begin to cluster around the cave entrance, pressing into the cool interior, with the particular delight of children discovering that the ground of something they have heard about as extraordinary is also up close, just a place. He stood there for a moment longer. Then he put 2 fingers to the brim of his hat to no one in particular and walked on down the hill. James Calloway lived in the cave for the rest of his life, which was longer than anyone in endurance expected it to be, including James. He died at 69 in the same cabin he had built with his own hands in the summer of 1883. By then, the cave had been a landmark for more than 20 years, visited by travelers who had heard about it, studied by builders who wanted to understand what it meant for the future of construction in the territory. Ottilie received them all with the same quiet directness she had always had. She showed them the thermometer and the root cellar and the stove and the chimney pipe running up through the rock fissure. She answered their questions in the precise language of a woman who has understood something completely and has had decades to refine how she explains it. They were buried together on the top of the cliff in a plot that looked directly down at the cave entrance below and out across the prairie beyond. It was where James had stood on the night before the blizzard looking at the lights of the town. It was where Ottilie had sometimes gone in the early mornings to watch the sun come up over the eastern plain in the years after James was gone, and the cave belonged only to her. In 1952, the South Dakota State Historical Society placed a bronze plaque at the cave entrance. It was fixed into the limestone to the right of the door, near the place where Copper, who had survived the blizzard in his cave stall with the calm of an animal that trusted its situation, had been buried in the spring of 1891. The plaque read, "Calloway's Folly, mocked as madness, proven as wisdom. In 1884, when the civilized world froze, this rock held. 27 lives were saved here. James and Ottilie Calloway taught an enduring lesson. The wise do not fight the land. They listen to it." The cave itself was still standing. The air inside it still held at 13 degrees winter, in summer indifferent to the seasons and the years, in the long accumulation of human opinion about what was wise and what was foolish, and what the difference between the two actually was when winter came to test it. On a morning in April, a long time after all of it, Ottilie sat at the cave entrance in the first warmth of the season and watched a colony of ants rebuilding their mound at the base of the limestone wall. The mound had been crushed by boot traffic over the winter. The ants did not appear to have an opinion about this. They were building. They carried material and placed it and went back for more, working without interruption in a pattern that was ancient and efficient and entirely indifferent to observation. Ottilie watched them for a long time. Above her, the April wind moved across the top of the cliff in the mild way of a wind that has nothing to prove. Down below on the prairie, the grass was beginning to come back, the first green of it showing through the matted remnants of last year's growth. The land was teaching again. It never stopped.